morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. Hopefully, you're here for the one using system signals as your organizational dashboard. But before we jump in, we really want to say thank you for the thoughtful questions you shared when you registered. They really helped us shape today's conversation around the issues that you hold matter most to you. So today, our goal is to share what we've been learning and how we've been walking with folks as more data becomes at our fingertips, what to pay attention to keep your organization focused on that North Star at the forefront of your actions, decisions, and efforts. So our main takeaways is what? Share why organizations are needing more than performance metrics to navigate change and the system signals that are feeling like conditions are evolving faster and faster in real time. Why? Because a system lens can help with that continuous learning to assess the changing conditions, strengthen that strategy, and identify where there's momentum, barriers, or even new opportunities emerging, and how. Here is our offering to you all is how do you use those system signals to strengthen that collective learning within your organization and community and folks you're working with, that supportive, adaptive decision making, and identify when to stay course, when to pivot, when to act. So we have two stories for you that we're going to share along the way. So be prepared to go to the market and then go to school right after. In both, we're going to ask you, how are you paying attention to read the system, which is the network of relationships, organizations, those policies and resources and community conditions that are influencing what you're trying to achieve, what some folks call that North Star. And signals, that word's used all the time. So we're going to say, what's a signal or early indicator that some of your organization's patterns, community, and that broader ecosystem might be feeling is shifting? Michelle and I, wave Michelle, say sometimes it's that usual head tilt, right? That, oh, that's interesting. That starts seeing emerging tensions. Are people more engaged? New opportunities, partnerships, and really seeing that shift in the policy that you're just not quite sure. And lastly, we're going to assume that you have that North Star and key metrics for this webinar and really focus on what and how to use system signals in a way to be action oriented, but hopefully we'll follow up with some FAQs. But before we jump in, we'll do some quick introduction. So we're community science. We're a team of social science and change agents working together to work alongside you all and partners, government agencies, foundations, and nonprofits to what are the solutions we need to those problems in our communities and make sure that it's the change that communities and you will want to see with data, lived experience, and voice together. And Michelle and I are your hosts today. So my name is Amber Trout. I'm the head of practice management, and this is Michelle Haynes-Baratz, who's the director and lead of community organization. And before we jump in, we'd love to see who's in the space with us. So what we're going to do is take a peek. So we see you all and launch a fun poll. Let's see if it should show up. We have opened, and we want to know what statement feels most true to you. You have lots of data, but it's not always clear what to do next. You can sense things are changing before they show up in reports. Ooh, and the data's moving. I could see it already. And some, you feel something's off, but you struggle to explain it. Or you're trying to balance the immediate demands with that long-term goal. You're like, I know something's coming, but today I have to get this off my to-do list, or I have to make sure someone has food, or I have to make sure I get this report done so the board approves reports. All right, it looks like we've stabilized, so let's see where good. Let's see. I'm not sure if the results are sharing. Well, we have 64% on the webinar. I was going to say a call. 64% on the webinar that's trying to balance those immediate needs with those long-term goals. I think that's most of us that when we were looking through the questions, we're saying, I have the data, but what do I pay attention to now? That's in service of that North Star. So sharing that, Michelle, why are organizations getting stuck?
Hi, folks. Why are folks getting stuck? Let's start, first of all, maybe with a pain point, right? So, like to storytell. Once upon a time, right, there was this problem. We didn't have enough data. Or maybe more accurately, we had ideas about whether data was important or what kind of data, right? People couldn't really rally around what to track, if anything. And so decisions were sort of based on anecdotes or who was the loudest person in the room. As a sector, we adapted, right? We started paying attention to more data. We built KPIs, right? These targeted quantitative numbers we can see, we can count how many people have we served, how many grants have we issued. And we got really intentional about using that information to guide decisions. And that is definitely, I would argue, a good thing. My colleagues will attest, I'm definitely a data head, good data set and cup of coffee, and I'm happy. I think the issue, though, is that the pendulum has swung too far. Because the challenge isn't so much that we don't have information or data, that it's actually that we have almost too much, right? Information is abundant, it's relentless, we're sort of swimming in it. And the problem is that more is not always better. So this is where we're going to go to the market, right? So more is not better. And I would love to tell you a story about jam. You may or may not be familiar with this study, but it was a really cool study done back in 2000 by Sheena Iyengar and a colleague, Mark Lepper, when they were at Columbia. And let's see if it resonates with you. So researchers, they set up a table at a grocery store, and in one version, they had shoppers who encountered 24 different kinds of jams. Okay. In another situation, they went into the grocery store and they only had 6 jams set up. Here's the interesting part. Larger display attracted more attention. People stopped, they browsed, they were curious, etc. However, smaller display actually led to more action, right? People were actually 10 times more likely to like walk out of the store with the jam to take action than when they had this abundance of choices at their fingertips. So I am not selling jam, but I love this example because I think it gives us some insight into what our intuition office tells us. More is better, and that's not necessarily the case, right? So we assume that more information, more options, more metrics, more reports, more dashboards are going to help us make better decisions. And, depending on where you're starting, yes, sometimes you do need more, but at some point it's noise and it can freeze us. And then we're so frozen by all the noise that we just move on to that very next thing, right? That's clamoring for our attention. So it's hard in the everyday. Folks have said, like, we're paying attention to what's happening every day. Information is coming at us. And so how is it that we can balance that abundance of information with what we're really paying attention to in the long run, which is what was coming up through the poll. So I think many would say that now it's sort of like more pressing than ever in terms of this information, right? There's probably 3 reasons, there's probably many more, but 3 that come to mind, at least for me, in terms of why there's so much information. And we have this sort of cognitive overload. So we have AI, um, undeniable. We could debate the merits, the challenges all day long. That's probably another webinar. But what is undeniable is that it has dramatically changed the rate at which information comes at us, right? And so we can generate summaries and data and reports and content at a pace that would be hard to imagine even a year or 2 ago. So there's that information itself, and then there's the question about the quality of that information, right? So we have a lot of information. Then we have the chaos, right? Or uncertainty, or there are lots of different words that we might use to characterize it, but the bottom line is that the environments that many of us are working in, they're shifting at a dizzying pace. Funding environments are changing, community needs are changing, public narratives are changing. And so what may have been true 6 months ago is not true today, and it very well may be shifting tomorrow or in the next 2 months, right? So we're always sort of on our toes. And then last but not least, we have burnout, right? So many organizations are being asked to do more with less. We have less time, we have less staff, we have less certainty, and we have more information, but less capacity to make sense of it, right? So if we take all of this together, the solution is not necessarily more data, it's more about discernment, right? And so We're not saying more. We're suggesting that it behooves us to actually, in this moment of urgency, to pause and to think about what actually deserves our attention. And that's actually how we get to this notion of system signals. So again, solution not necessarily more data. It's really actually about what you do with it and the sense making. So we have sort of a Goldilocks situation going on here, right? So we have that first far left image where you have too little information. Um, where, it can lead us operating in uncertainty. That's intended to communicate sort of a wobbliness. So too little information. Not only are we potentially uncertain about what's happening, but I would argue even potentially worse is this idea of false certainty, right? We think we understand what's happening because we have one story, we have one metric, we have one picture that we're paying attention to, and then actually we get in a pickle because we are missing something. Too much information, not necessarily much better, right? You get sucked into that rabbit hole. Very guilty on occasion, right? So one more metric, one more question, one more article, one more. And then the next thing you know, we're back to jam, right? Overload. I'm walking out of the store, I'm not buying the jam. We freeze. We don't take action. So the goal is really to figure out like, how do we get balanced, right? How is it that you can take the kinds of information that's important? What are the signals that you might pay attention to so that you can interpret the data that you are collecting and that you are seeing in a way that gives you insight into what's happening, not just what's happening, but frankly, also why it's happening. And if we can get a little bit at the why, then we can also hopefully adjust, course correct, pivot as needed in more real time. So this is why maybe traditional measurement dashboards, if you will, which depending on who you talk to are sort of all the rage, where they kind of hit a limit, right? So if we think about that sort of traditional dashboard, the KPI, it tells us what happened. It tells us how we're performing. It tells us about outcomes. Um, and it is often, frankly, retrospective, right? So it's like, here's a baseline. We started here at some current state, and we want to know, have we gotten there yet? Want to take a pause and say, paying attention to outcomes is important. That is not what we're saying here. We're not saying that we don't want to pay attention to outcomes. They are part of your North Star. They help us track progress. They help us keep ourselves accountable to ourselves, to our communities, to the work that we're doing. But while dashboards are good at telling us about what happened, they often don't tell us about why. And they don't sometimes allow us, the way they're typically constructed, to be anticipatory. So they don't tell us about the context the work is happening in, or the conditions that are sort of swirling about, that are influencing how that outcome might be moving or not, right? One more thing worth mentioning, one of the pros, one of the advantages of dashboards actually is that they can be quite helpful for focusing our attention. And that's wonderful. And the tension is that sometimes it narrows our aperture, if you will, a little bit too much. So, and we've seen that in our work at Community Science when we work with folks. People are becoming so focused on a dashboard, a particular metric, they sort of are running towards that they stop paying attention to the broader conditions or signals that are sort of shaping that metric. So, what we're offering is sort of a third space, if you will, this idea of system signals. Okay. So the idea is that we're paying attention to the system signals, early indicators, noticing what's happening in the ethos. We're reading the conditions, we're interpreting the patterns. Um, we're noticing what might be changing, shifting, because that is often where the story actually lives. And importantly, we are using that information to sense make. So it's not just more information that we're collecting, we're using it as an interpretive lens to make sense of why some of the outcomes that we're interested may or may not be moving. So System signals, what are they? We like definitions, those are helpful. They're early cues, right? That conditions are changing. So they are early indicators that something in your organization, in your partnerships, in your community, in your broader ecosystem, something might be shifting. And so those can appear as unusual data points. They can be changing behaviors, emerging tensions, new opportunities, etc., that don't necessarily fit into what we've seen before. And so if we think about sort of the dashboard as being like what happened, the system signal is is what might be changing, if you will. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Amber to tell us a little bit more about what that might look like.
Most organizations manage what they could see. Guilty, but that's not a bad thing. It's a yes and. What shapes progress, setbacks, and change usually happens beneath the surface. That's where the sailboat on a river really helps, right? Because it helps you understand the swells and the undercurrents and the tailwinds that are shaping your response to an event or a reaction when change happens. This is where we find the sailboat here in the middle really helpful as it's trying to make it to its destination. So there's you, the organization today, trying to get to that orange flag of your North Star tomorrow. And that's where we're trying to understand how do you keep that equilibrium, right, going when you might have a counter current or a hidden obstacle you didn't think about, or you've made progress and then there's a response from status quo coming at you as you're trying to get those momentum going. You also have your system signals here on the right-hand side where you're thinking about what are the relationships? What's the trust? What are the different narratives in the ecosystem? What are the power dynamics? This could either help facilitate or be catalytic or take the winds out of your sails, quite literally, with trying to get to your North Star. And so this is what happens for listening, reading, and adapting to know, okay, if I have KPIs, if I have outcomes, these are milestones, but it's not smooth sailing. You have to know when you have to go around a rock, when you have to open the sails more to get more momentum, or you know that undercurrent's coming. So you might actually have to tag your boat back and forth and you can't go straight at your goal. So that's where we found it really helpful because then you know what to do when it's uncertain, a little overwhelmed, or the metrics are giving you a false sense of clarity. It's really step back. What do I need to understand to go towards my North Star? Are we able to go smooth sailing straight ahead, or is there something underneath hitting the boat at the bottom? Do we have momentum and political will or a shift in the narrative in the community to keep going forward with the solution? Great. It's also important to see when there's the fatigue happening, which is also could be a countercurrent. So this is why we use the sail. We hope it helps you see how to navigate those wells, waves, undercurrents, and rocks. There it is. Right. And so often you hear system lens, and that's great, but we're looking system lens proactive. So how are you reading the system that's influencing your network of relationships, organizations, policies, resources, and those community conditions? So on the right-hand side where it says operations, so those are your daily decisions that you see right here. See, trying to see you right here. But there's that future horizon, right? The rolling waves that you're trying to get to. In the middle is that third space where you're checking in. What's the trust and relationship internally? Are we burning out? Are we reaching out to the community? Are we seen as a trusted entity? Is there a shift in public opinion? What is the resources? What is there any policy changes? How would that impact long term? And then the conditions. Is there changes in the policy and narrative and lived experiences? And so the gray kind of bubbly triangles are the different buckets. We don't want to say like categorical, but buckets of how we organize ourselves when thinking about, that head tilt we started with, this seems different. So instead of getting jammed up, right, it's thinking about, okay, what am I seeing in terms of my relationships? Are people leaning in and more engaged or leaning out, right? What is happening in the conversation that might influence the resources and money, right? How are the conditions happening in my community? Is there more need for food and diapers than we've seen before? What does that mean long term? And so this is where we want to go to school and bring an example to bring this to life. So hang in there. What I want you to do is imagine a coalition of organizations working together to improve early learning across the region and influence at the state level. The coalition has two goals: more children in high quality learning environments and a stronger, more stable childhood workforce. One of its KPIs is the number of early learning sites that meet a defined standard of quality. And another is the workforce retention, how many early educators stay in their role from year to year. For a while, these numbers look stable, right? The wave is sailing, we're riding the wave. Then quality ratings begin to flatten. A few providers lose ground, and the workforce starts to turn over. The first reaction might be to look at the providers and ask, are you implementing the quality framework? Are directors coaching staff well? Are teachers getting enough professional development? Are programs using those tools available? These are fair questions, but they may not explain what's happening. Purple, that third space. When the coalitions look more closely, it sees signals around the system. Wages of early educators are not keeping up with the nearby schools. Retail employers or healthcare jobs. Child subsidy reimbursement rates are lagging behind the actual cost. License requirements are changing, then changing again, but providers don't have enough time to adjust. Training is available, but it's offered at times when small providers cannot release their staff. Family needs more traditional hours, untraditional hours for care, but providers can't staff those hours without losing money. The KPI made the problem visible, but the system signals are making the problem understandable so that you can. How do you move through? So the KPIs is telling us what's happening to the performance, and the system signals we described in this example are telling us whether this surrounding system still has the capacity, trust, clarity, and adaptability to sustain, because you're rocking and rolling, or to improve the performance. Without those signals, the coalition might push harder on the providers. So it might sound more like more training, more compliance, more reporting, more accountability. But the problem is not the providers alone. So Michelle's aperture. It's a set of conditions shaping what the providers can realistically do. Once the coalition sees the signals, the response changes. It works on wage strategies, reimbursement policies, shared services, better time training, substitute pools, and stronger state and regional coordination. So now our KPI is the scoreboard, but the system signals are the conditions on the field. And that matters because the KPI rarely is a straight line. It might be flat for months or even years, and then there's a hockey stick increase because after a policy change. Or it might stair step when new funding reaches providers, but then other times it might fall off a cliff because there's changes in workforce shortages, rising costs, or a policy requirement that all hit at the same time. So a KPI again tells us what changed, and the system signals help us understand what's changing around the work early enough to respond. So let's see what that looks like in a pathway of change. And for us in community science, this is one way we try to think. So a pathway of change is if I do this, that leads to the next step I could take. So let's walk through this slowly together, friends. So on the left-hand side is your what's, right? The daily operation. You have parents. They need childcare availability now. Your early learning workforce professionals want a living wage now. There's the healthcare, child relationships. You want that to be positive. You know that's important. You know families need essentials, the food and the housing and other necessities. But on the other side, your long-term North Star is that there's an improved, meaningful, materialistically proved quality of life for your families, kids, and child providers. And you've selected day one pre-K readiness and accessibility to increase accessibility to quality of care. For us, that mapping of the middle is the signals. So what are those capacities, right? The trust. How are you working together? How are you making decisions together? How are you tracking the knowledge of the different issues so that you could select which lever and tactic makes sense for you to keep working on that long-term outcome? Is it narrative change effort? Maybe it's leading locally, or it's focusing on different financial strategies. Is it a public policy partnership? Is it a fund at a state level, a county level? And what can you and your ecosystem of partners and community members move together on? So you have the ability to influence either at the state level or the local level or leaders to rally around. And so some of the outcomes, short to long, some can look like strengthening base and what is that shared vision together to influence a policy on wages, right? It could be strengthen the alliance of solidarity of showing up for each other. And also could be the capacity to act together. That means a coordination. If, say, for example, you want to get a memo out, but there's 4 organizations in this coalition. When you first started, it took 6 months to get a memo out in response to a new policy. Now it takes you 2 days to even a day to get it out so it's responsive. These are creating the political will, perhaps, for this example, to find those possibilities. So, a window of possibility, a policy of possibility, a window of action. And the policy change in itself is not always the win, right? It's how are you building your capacity, that wave to be stronger and stronger the next time towards that goal. So, this is one way, it's illustrative, to think about the middle, right? That third middle, and what data do I use to sense make to get from my daily operations, which I have to focus on, but still have time, the purple, to think about what gets me closer to our North Star, which is the long horizon. But another question that we got from you all is like, okay, I got the data, but what questions am I asking? And so that's when I have to go back to our data friend, Michelle.
Thank you. Okay, so what types of questions do we ask about the data?
I know you
Um,
love these.
I do. I like to ask clarification questions, as many will say. So, well, before I get into like questions, another way to think about it is like how do I know what to pay attention to in terms of these system signals or early indicators? And I'm going to offer a few sort of orientations first as you scan the environment, and then I'll get to questions. Um, so one way to think about it is sort of this idea of a Venn diagram, right? So thinking through overlap, opening that aperture, and like it's fun to be playful, right? And to think about, okay, how might my North Star, the things that I care about, actually interact with some of the other topics that are in the ethos. So let's stick with education. Um, if I am interested in early education, why am I maybe paying attention to the stock market, right? Well, because if I'm paying attention to the stock market, that might be telling me about inflation. That might be telling me about the cost of living. That might be telling me something about whether I can afford child care, the cost of care, whether or not there are opportunities for fundraising, possibly from certain kinds of folks about childcare, right? There's all sorts of things that um, are possible, but if I'm just paying attention to early education, I might not necessarily be paying attention to the stock market. But if I did, it might give me some early signals about what's coming down the pike. Okay, so that's one possibility. I also offer this idea of when we play with these ideas of Venn diagrams, like what's the proximity perspective? Okay, so what's the likelihood that the stock market, for example, is going to matter to me and my North Star today, tomorrow, 6 months from now, or a year, and play that out because that might help you plan, right? How quickly do you need to adapt? Do you need to adapt right now? Do you need to be thinking about adaptation a month later? So it gives you also a horizon that you can play with in terms of incorporating this information. Another orientation, which it's certainly related to all of these things, is this idea of curiosity, right? Sort of speculative what if questions, why? Or the idea again is to sort of open that aperture and see what kinds of connections might actually be worth thinking through. So it might be paying attention to narratives that might not align with the kinds of narratives I concur or agree with, but that might spur some ideas about what I pay attention to or how I might come up with opportunities for bridging. That's one possibility. We might also stick with the education example. And so, again, if I'm paying attention to that narrow space, I might miss opportunities until they are so squarely in my problem space that I have to deal with them. And so if they're being forced upon me rather than me having the opportunity to consider what if. So again, if my North Star is about early education, why am I paying attention to the world of AI? I mean, now it might seem kind of obvious, but at the same time, if I am paying attention to AI and I'm paying attention to it really early on, it might help me anticipate developments in terms of what does that mean for curriculum development, right? Even if I'm interested in early education, what does that mean in terms of not only the kids that I'm interested in serving now, but those kids and what their life might look like even 20 years from now? Social development, what kinds of jobs those children might be tracking into eventually over time. And so, again, the idea is that if we always have this sort of narrow problem space, we might miss the opportunity to consider what if. So those are some sort of orientations, if you will, and some of the questions that I personally always come back to sort of tell you if you're on track or should you be noticing. It's like, what are you noticing? What feels different, right? I'll often like to use that orientation. What's the same? What's different? And if something is different, why might that be different? What's easier? What's harder? What feels like it keeps coming up in conversations across spaces, but it hasn't shown up in any formal metrics yet? Um, Honestly, it's oftentimes the signal is not a number. I mean, it's great if it is, but if we know that context is really incredibly important, and so paying attention to that, and sometimes it's a pattern that people are naming over again. And then the last thing is, okay, if I'm noticing something, again, playing through, what if this continues? What if it's not a one-time blip? And what would we do differently if this turns out to become an even stronger signal, right, in the ecosystem? What might start out as a small ripple might turn into a huge wave. And so, how can we start to anticipate those small ripples so that we can anticipate the wave so that we can ride it? And I don't surf, but do something wonderful with it and ride it perfectly. um, and lastly, I'm going to say that I think it's also okay if you're asking all of these questions and the answer is I'm not sure yet, right? Because sometimes the right move is not to act immediately. It's to stay curious. It's to continue to ask the question, to continue to bring the question and the signal into the conversation with partners and to see if they're also noticing similar kinds of patterns. So, with that, we'll talk a little bit more about how you do this in your organizational setting, right? What are some of the spaces in which you might consider asking these kinds of sense-making questions and at what cadence? So, go ahead.
And this is a question we heard. We got you. What is a signal? What questions do I ask? And then how do I use it in my organization? And one thing Michelle and I have been saying is institutional memory, right? Who's doing, what are the different roles in your organization? Who's paying attention on the front lines or at the program level? Who's connecting the dots when insights need to go across programs under departments? And then who's holding when to act and pivot? Because that can't be one person. And so that's what we're offering here, that there's different stages of the purple, of the sense making. There's the learning while doing. So that's in the team meetings, what Michelle was just describing, the types of questions. And then has this pattern or this insight or this behavior uh, appeared more than two or three times, right? So you're tweaking, you're still doing process improvement, right? You're kind of paying attention, you're reading the lay of the land. Then there's learning while doing. I mean, learning from doing, right? So now perhaps you're at a quarterly department meeting and you're bringing that noticing like, yo, I'm on the fourth month of people needing more diapers at a rate that I haven't seen before, right? And so that might spur up like, oh my goodness, I've been having parents ask me about. So then you start understanding, do we need to start preparing for a diapered fund or um, what else could be rippling throughout. So you're learning together and bringing in more signals, and you're deciding, do I stay? Do we hold? Do we a tweak, or do we have a pivot coming on our horizon? And that's where that learning forward comes in. It could be annually, it could be biannually. That's where you're now evaluating. So you have your process improvement tweaks in your team meetings. You're going to your quarterly department meetings, program meetings, or when you meet up with different folks in different parts of your organization to learn, hey, what are you seeing? What are you noticing? Is it shifting how we approach our North Star? And now you're bringing all the pieces together. Like Michelle said, a dashboard's not bad. It's when you use it, right? So how are we looking at the changing of the outcomes or the metrics you've selected for your organization? What does that mean with some of the movement you're seeing in, like in your face right now with the purple trying to move forward to keep building that momentum to the North Star, knowing there's that rip curl. It doesn't take you by surprise, so you could keep working towards progress. And so folks have this cadence. It's called a learning agenda or a shared agenda, where there's pauses organizationally and with different units to think together. What does this mean? We have a lot of information coming at us right now. There's 24 jams in front of us, and we need to know which six do we pay attention to. And so that's what we wanted to share with you today. What does that mean practically? So we always have to say one way to bridge it to your reality is what are some of those team meetings or strategy check-ins or learning agendas that you have right now or that you could use? Then getting started, you could think, what are 3 or 5 signals as a group that you're just going to check in together on? How do you make them visible, right? So you could have a shared document. I've worked with folks that have photographs or pictures to see the change, if it's changed or not. Uh, and then how do you build on those existing cadences? So this is where the fatigue comes in that Michelle said at the top of the webinar. If you're adding something new, it's not going to last. But if you already have these structured meetings or places where you're converge, how is it added to the agenda as an existing part of the conversation? Again, this is the interpretation, the practice. So that's why we're saying, how does it just become part of being in your practice that is in service of when you have your KPI check-in, in service of when you're seeing how things are going as a team, and really strengthening something you're already doing. So with that, we want to take a moment and say, what questions do you have for us? We're curious. And so you could drop them in the chat. We're happy to answer those. Letting them come in. I know one that, here it is. Yep. So you have all this data, but then how do you prioritize? Oh, raised hand. I'm not sure if that, I see your raised hand and I'm not sure. You might have to type it in. I don't know if you have audio to speak. I'm so sorry. I have a friend that has a raised hand.
The raised hand.
So prioritization was another one that came up in the questions, and we'll make sure to the person with the raised hand, we'll figure out how to get that question to you or to us so that we can answer. Is how do I decide when to go slow, and when to watch, right? So when do I act? And that's when there's a high consequence and you have high consequence to a signal that's going to change because there's a policy change, or you hear a sentiment that that only certain types of family structures should be able to have childcare, right? So what consequence can that have in the funding? So then what confidence do you have that you need to either advocate or think about other sources of money? So that could be a go, right? Because that's going to impact you in 6 months. A slow is another way to prioritize, like another bucket. So you have go. Slow could be there's an emerging concern, but you're uncertain. You're not quite sure how it's going to impact you, but you know it's going to. So you need more time. So it's still sitting in your learning cadence and being kind of metabolized through the organization to know when it's shifts to go. And then the third bucket is you're watching. Like Michelle said, it might be something like the stock market or inflation. It feels tangential, but it does interface with your organization and the North Star and change the constellation. Remember, conditions, resources, and money, and your policies, right? How does that shift or buckets that we had? So, prioritization for that question, go, slow, or watch. Michelle, did we have one that surfaced?
Yes, I am looking here. Okay. So one question that is coming up, the question is about catching those conversational observations. It's easy for folks to notice in the context of a discussion, but if it isn't a process or an expectation of capturing those, I have noticed that those learnings get missed. So speaks a little bit to the process piece, right? So making it part, I can start, but I think it's part of it is really instituting processes in your teams and in your different spaces so that those are become normative in terms of the types of conversations that one is having. So you have the conversation, and maybe it's even a check-in and a check-out, right? So checking in, what are we noticing, reflection in the moment, and then before we just say, okay, see you next week or next month, it is, okay, so what are some possibilities, implications for how we use this information in terms of feeding it into the feedback loop? And I know that we have often been in times where we will engage in this process once or twice, and eventually we will be in the position where like, this feels important enough to elevate it to the client in a memo or to have another subsequent conversation because it feels like it might change an outcome or the way someone is navigating the space. And so, not offering things always, I suppose we like to say imperfectly perfect, like perfectly imperfect, but it's still information and it's still real time. And that's one way to do it. Amber, do you have any?
Yeah, I think the yes and, real short, is
Hmm.
internally you can have a timeline of this quarter we noticed these things, right?
Hmm.
And on that same document, you have you're noticing in quarter two or whenever your team meetings are, and you have it side by side. So this is where the different roles, who's going to be that person internally for you, to have a timeline of decisions and just noting what's going on externally to you. We have another question about like an example of a dashboard, Michelle, or they're kind of having a hard time describing it. So, of like, what does a dashboard look like? And I feel what I heard you saying is your dashboard's great. It's what you do in the in-between space. And so wondering how are you thinking about data that way? When you have a dashboard, and where do the signals exist when you're organizing yourself internally around all this data?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the idea is to have those two things intentionally talk to one another. I think that when we think about dashboards, we think about fancy, flashy, like it's one number, it's something that we're consistently tracking, so on and so forth. Those things are true. The idea really, sorry, everything is kind of disappearing. And I think that the idea is also, though, to make sure that you are taking these data insights that you're having in these interstitial conversations and the sense making and the learning, and then you're feeding them back into the information loop, right? So it might be, it's not a matter of getting rid of the dashboard or adding to the dashboard. It's when you are interfacing with the dashboard, how do you make sense of what it is that you are seeing so that you can interpret it in a particular way and that it's not just totally acontextual and metric based. So it's not about adding more to the dashboard as much as I think it is making sure that you're taking into account all of those contextual cues as you review the information.
Yeah, those qualitative stories that you're coming
Yeah.
with to bring life. Again, you could think about the kind of bubbly triangles as buckets of that purple space to bring forth. And then we had another question around narrative change and how do you know through the system signals that perhaps you're making progress? And I think one way you could think about it, there is a paper, PCI, we could put it in our follow-up of thinking like if your first go, right, your first strategy or tactic is to inform people there is an issue, right? And now maybe you're on that informing, but notice like your business folks or your insurance companies are like, yes, we know. We really need to make sure that there's enough early learning slots. You're like, okay, now you know it's time for influencing and helping. What do you do with that? Now that you are have a shared understanding what the issue is, now what is our tactics and strategies to organize around influencing policy, right? Then that could then shift to increasing or impacting that ultimate goal. So it's more of a spectrum, and you're paying attention to what's being talked about and how you can move or what's possible with the awareness. And then as soon as your folks in your community and your networks are like, yes, we have awareness that we all agree this is an issue, then you move on to influence. And I will say that the last question we have, and we'll provide some follow up on the webinars, like how do I communicate to my leadership? There is a shift in the systems that may not be showing up in the KPI or the board reports or the formal materials that you're providing or feeding into the system. And one thing we offer is think situation, complication, answer, question, then answer, right? So that helps get attention. This is the situation. Here's how it might complicate us advancing our mission. Here's the question we have to answer that this system signal is bringing us at an interface. What does AI do to curriculum and maybe even social emotional well-being? And here's the answer or solution towards that. Another way to think about how to communicate a system signal, right? Because it might feel overwhelming. So we don't need to pass the jam story on to others is what's changed since we've last talked? Why does it matter to us right now or in the next 6 months? What is a risk or unclear if we did nothing or monitored? And what is the opportunity or momentum building action, behavior, decision we could do now, and then ending with what organization or person can consider to do next, right? So then it's that unfreezing, like, oh, you told me that there's something happening and we should do it, but sometimes someone just needs that first step. Consider this. So those are ways you could communicate the system signals. And my personal favorite is how do you find that visual or that Moana story to say Moana went out on an adventure, she found some friends and came back stronger to work towards, finding herself and what it means to be part of a community, right? And then when you're interacting with folks, either in the community or in your organization, you say, where are we on this journey, right? Are we back at the start? Are we all in it together? Do we have a clear vision? And so those are different ways to explain the signal shifts. So then you could decide, what do we do? Pivot, pause, act. I think we got all of the questions. Michelle, is there any last words of wisdom before we send our friends off for the afternoon, evening, or into the afternoon?
Oh, good question. Just appreciations for being with us, and to, I suppose, continue to stay curious. We often are balancing lots of tensions. Is it more? Is it less? And I think the idea is that sometimes it is a both and, but following the ripple, right? And trusting your gut. One thing that we talk about these as system signals. I mean, another way to think about it is like it's like organizational spidey senses, kind of. I mean, that's sort of what we're we're talking about. So there's nothing wrong with trusting your gut. And if something feels it's afoot, follow it. Maybe it's nothing, but maybe it's something. But it is also a muscle to continue to hone those spidey senses and see if it can get you to be able to feel like a very chaotic world is a little bit more manageable because you're able to navigate and track some patterns. So
Thank you very much, everyone. Take good
take
care.
take good care. Thanks, folks.